Today we're moving into community and population ecology, which studies how populations grow and change and how species interact within those ecosystems. Think of it as zooming in from the big picture of ecosystems to the living species and the pieces that make it up. How many organisms are there? Where do they live? How do they affect each other? In environmental sciences matters because population growth and community interactions connect directly to issues like resource use, biodiversity loss, invasive species, and conservation planning. We're going to start with population growth and carrying capacity, then shift to urbanization and the demographic transitions, and finish with ecological footprints and resource demands. As we go through these themes, you'll notice that population patterns aren't just biological. They're tied to economics, technology, culture, and policy. Population change is driven by four main factors: births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. Births and immigration add individuals, whereas deaths and emigration remove the individuals. A key concept here is carrying capacity. The maximum population an environment can support indefinitely without degrading those resources. Humans have grown exponentially over the past 2 centuries, meaning the population increases faster as the population gets larger. This isn't automatically bad, but it creates pressure on the systems like food, water, and energy. So, a quick example, if we think about a small town, it can handle growth up to a point. Roads, water supply, housing, and waste systems have limits. Same concept goes at a global scale. We have to look at these systems on an individual basis and then put them together on that global scale in order to get different perspectives. When a population grows beyond carrying capacity or puts too much pressure on it, the environment begins to experience negative consequences in three main areas: resource depletion, scarcity, and environmental degradation. A major consequence is resource depletion, which occurs when natural resources are used faster than they can be replaced. As populations grow, demand increases for fossil fuels, forests, minerals, fertile soil, and agricultural land. Over time, this overuse reduces the availability of these resources and often makes them more expensive or difficult to access. If resources are not managed sustainably, they can become exhausted or permanently damaged. As resources are depleted, scarcity and population often increase. Growing populations produce more waste and pollution than ecosystems can absorb. Common examples include air pollution from vehicles and industry, industrial waste contaminating land and water, and ocean acidification caused by excess carbon dioxide. Pollution not only harms those ecosystems, but also creates health risks for human populations that depend on clean air and water and soil. Another major issue is environmental degradation, which refers to long term damage to land and ecosystems. Examples include soil erosion caused by poor farming practices, desertification, where productive land becomes dry and unusable, and urban sprawl that replaces natural habitat with roads, buildings, and pavement. These changes reduce the environmental ability to support life, which can further lower carrying capacity over time. Exceeding carrying capacity also leads to food and water stress. Crop failures can occur when soil are degraded or water becomes scarce. Groundwater is often overpumped to meet growing demands. This is a really big issue in Florida right now. And pollution can contaminate remaining supplies. When food and water systems are strained, communities face higher costs and increased risk of shortages, which we also have been seeing here in Florida. We can think of groundwater as a bank account. Rain slowly adds water into the account, while wells withdraw water from it. If groundwater is pumped faster than it can be replenished, the account balance drops. This can cause wells to run dry. It can also allow saltwater intrusion in coastal areas and force communities to spend more money drilling deeper wells or treating water. Even if water still flows from the tap today, overuse creates serious problems for the future. Now let's connect population growth to development. The demographic transition model explains how population growth changes as society moves from a pre industrial to a post industrial system. At the same time, urbanization, which is migration from rural areas to cities, has increased so much that over half of the world's population now lives in cities. Rapid urban growth can create challenges like overcrowding, population, um, strained infrastructure. Think about the housing shortages, the traffic congestion, stormwater flooding. But cities also create opportunities: efficient public transportation, smaller per person footprints, district energy systems, and better access to education and healthcare. So there are some trade offs. This table shows the stages pretty clearly. Let's interpret it like a story. Stage one, we have pre industrial atmosphere. This includes high birth rates and high death rates. There's little net growth happening. Stage two is considered transitional. Death rates fall quickly, mainly due to sanitation and medicine, but birth rates stay pretty high. At this stage, you start to have some rapid growth. Stage three, industrial. Birth rates begin to fall, mainly due to access to better education, contraception, and urban life. Growth starts to slow down. Stage four, post industrial. We have low births and low deaths. This results in a stable population or even a slow decline. Stage five, declining. At this stage, we have very low birth rates. The population starts to shrink. This is a model. So real countries don't always fit perfectly, and migration can also shift the outcomes of these pretty dramatically. But typically, as countries develop, these are the stages that we start to see. So now we've talked about the number of people in these systems. We're going to shift over to how much each person uses. An ecological footprint estimates the amount of land and resources needed to support a person or population's lifestyle. We compare that to biocapacity, which is Earth's ability to regenerate those resources. When the footprint is greater than biocapacity, we're in what's called an ecological overshoot. The big drivers of that include fossil fuel use, meat-heavy diets, high consumption and waste, and high energy use and water use. So let's say we have two people. They may live in the same city, but one has a much larger footprint if they drive a larger vehicle daily, or they eat a lot of meat and buy a lot of new products instead of repairing or reusing those. That person is going to have a higher footprint than the person who uses less. Now let's talk about population characteristics. Two key terms we use here are population size and population density. Population size is the total number of individuals. The bigger the population, you usually have more genetic variations, which can improve the ability for that population to adapt. Then we have population density, the number of individuals per unit area. Density affects competition, or how easily an organism can find resources or find a mate, and sometimes this can even affect social behaviors. So how do we estimate population sizes? Directly counting can be accurate, but often it's pretty impractical. So we use sampling methods. Quadrants are used for slow or immobile organisms like plants. Mark and recapture is a good method for mobile organisms. With the mark recapture formula, we use n equals the marked first catch times the total second catch divided by the total number marked in the second catch. This example on this slide shows that we have 80 individuals marked on the first catch, and we're multiplying that by the total from the second catch, which is 100. And then we divide that by the number marked in the second catch, which is 20. This gives us a total of 400. That estimation assumes that marked individuals mix back into that population randomly. Thinking about species distribution. Species aren't always spread out randomly in nature. We have typically three patterns. The first is random. This is unpredictable spacing, like the wind dispersing seeds from a plant. Then we have clumped. These are grouped in patches. They're usually the most common, and this is where you start to see like those little patchworks within a forest. And then we have uniform. These are evenly spaced, and usually they're due to territorial behavior or competition. We see this in zebra populations and even penguins. One tool that can be used is a life table, and this organizes survival and mortality usually by age. It can show the probability of dying before the next age, the mortality rate by each age group, and the life expectancy at each interval. So if we look at this example used on the slide, it shows that Dall mountain sheep often show higher mortality in their early and late stages of life. And this is pretty common in a lot of species. We can also use survivor curves. These are visual ways to compare life strategies. There's three classic types. Type 1, you have low early mortality and high late mortality in life. An example of these would be humans and a lot of different mammals. Type 2, we have constant mortality rates throughout life. This includes a lot of birds. Type 3, we have high early mortality, but survivors live pretty long. And an example of this would be fish population or trees or marine invertebrates. This slide shows the long-term patterns in human population. As you can see, they stayed relatively stable for a very long period of time, but then we had this rapid spike. And this is specifically occurs after the Industrial Revolution. This spike is directly contributed to advancements in agriculture, sanitation, and medicine. These three things allowed human populations to survive much better than they previously were. So if you ever hear people talking about how our ancestors lived perfectly fine without these things, and that wasn't exactly true. People died pretty frequently back then. When we look at this slide, we can see how the increase in a billion people changes over time. So the interval to which we add 1 billion people. It went from 1 billion people every 130 years to just 12. And the big takeaway here is it's not just more people, it's that the systems have to be able to scale quickly in order to accommodate this drastic increase. So that means that things like food production, energy infrastructure, housing, and waste management have to be sufficient enough for the population to increase this quickly. Now you'll notice it's projected that there's going to be a time, it's actually happening now, where the number of years starts to increase again. And this is likely due to those resource needs. So once we get to the point where we can't accommodate that fast of a population growth anymore, the number of years that it takes to add a billion people is going to start to increase again. Humans follow ecological principles like any other species, but we've also increased our carrying capacity through technology. So things like agriculture, fossil fuel use, trade networks, medicine, and public health. However, raising carrying capacity can come with trade offs, especially for other species. This includes habitat conservation, pollution, and resource depletions. So, what's driving this population growth? Mainly reduced deaths. And this comes from improved sanitation, clean water, and better waste. We also have advancements in science, from antibiotics and vaccines. This curbed infection rates. For example, the bubonic plague killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population. But thanks to medical advancements, we don't see many problems with this anymore. We do still see disease affecting growth, though. In sub-Saharan Africa, the growth rate dropped after 1985 due to HIV and AIDS, and this caused a 7-year decrease in life expectancy by 2005. We also see how urbanization and agricultural innovation have helped, but this is mainly supported by fossil fuels. And by using those, we were able to expand food supplies and reduce mortality. So there can be trade offs with these. Age structure shows how many individuals are in a different age group. It predicts future growth. So rapid growth nations tend to have pyramid shapes, with many young people at the bottom and fewer older people at the top. A stable growth shows a relatively balanced shape, so about the same number on the bottom as there are on the top. And some countries even show a shrinking population where there's a narrower base and a wider peak. A large population of youth means future growth. Even if the birth rates start to drop, more people are entering into those reproductive years. So we can anticipate that in the future, if there's a large youth population, there's a good chance there's going to be population increase. When we look at economic development, it can say a lot about a population. This slide shows that high growth rates are concentrated in parts of Africa and Asia, while many European countries show low or zero growth. This connects back to the demographic transition models. Different regions are at different stages due to differences in things like healthcare access, education, economic structure, and women's empowerment. A biological community is all the populations of different species living and interacting in the same habitat. This is where we start to think about relationships like predation, competition, mutualism, and parasitism, because communities are shaped by these interactions. If we look at predation and herbivory, predation is where one organism kills and consumes another. Herbivory is where they consume a particular plant. An example of predation would be the classic hare-lynx cycle. Hares are prey. As the number of hares increases, so does the number of lynxes, which are the predators. We create more food, we create more predators. But as they start to consume those hares, the prey numbers decrease. That leaves less resources for the lynxes to grow, so therefore the lynx populations start to decline as well. And we see this over time where there's a constant increase in prey followed by an increase in predator. And the same thing, reduction in prey, reduction in predator. Herbivory is very similar. The animals consume the plants. This often drives the plant's defenses and can influence the different community composition of those plants in the area. Predators and prey can also influence each other's evolution over time. This can lead to the development of defense mechanisms. Things that are mechanical, chemical, they can be behavioral or camouflage, or what's considered mimicry. Let's take a look at some of these defense mechanisms. Our first example, we have a honey locust that has a very long thorn poking out of it. This protects the plant from predation by probably some type of herbivore like a deer. We have chemical examples. So the fire-bellied toad and the foxgloves both emit a substance that makes them unpalatable, and often sometimes these can be very toxic substances. And in low concentrations, they probably aren't going to kill anything, but in higher concentrations, they potentially could. We can have behavioral or chemical examples. The first example is a walking stick. It looks just like a stick, and they usually hang out on plants. They blend in very well. We also have a chameleon where they will change color depending on their environment. They also have specific movements. They go very slowly, and when they do this rocking motion where they mimic like a plant that gets blown by the wind. So it doesn't look like that rapid movement you see in a lot of animals. It looks more like kind of a blowing like leaf on a tree. We have Batesian mimicry, where a non-harmful species resembles a harmful one. In this case, we have a hoverfly that looks very similar to a wasp. And then we have Mullerian mimicry, where species that are harmful tend to look very similar. All of these butterflies have a red, black, and yellow pattern, and all are inedible to most predators. So if they try and eat them, they're probably going to just spit them out, but if they do eat them, it might make them pretty sick. There's also the competitive exclusion principle. This states that no two species can occupy the exact same niche indefinitely. Eventually, one's going to outcompete the other. So competition often pushes species towards specialization, or the development of different food sources, habitat zones, or activity times to reduce that overlap. And one area we see this is in Paramecium aurelia, which primes and outgrows the Paramecium caudatum when they're grown together. So one of them's taking over that area and outcompeting that other one. We can also see this in bird populations. So sometimes you'll have certain species that will feed higher in canopies, while some species will feed lower in them. Symbiosis describes the relationship that organisms have with each other. And the first one we're going to talk about is commensalism, where one species benefits, but the other's unaffected. And we can see this when birds build their nest in a tree. The bird benefits, but that tree is unaffected. With mutualism, both species benefit. So one example we see is in termites. They have microbes in their digestive system that allow them to digest cellulose. So the termites provide the habitat and the food, but the microbe helps them break that food down so they can use it. Lichens also have a mutualistic relationship with fungi or algae. The algae make the sugar, the fungi provide the structure and the moisture protection in order for both of them to um, work together. Pollination is also a huge example of mutualism. So bees getting nectar, plants being able to reproduce, that's a form of mutualism. Finally, we have parasitism, where one species benefits and the other is harmed. Tapeworms are an example of this. We see them in dogs and cats all the time, but they're also in other organisms. The tapeworm benefits because it's getting nutrients, but it's doing so at the detriment to the host. In most cases, parasites don't want to kill their host because then that means they lose their benefit, but they will make them usually pretty sick. And the increase in the spread of parasites and other pathogens can increase when ecosystems are stressed or when human land use changes or increases contact among wildlife or livestock or people even. Next, we're going to talk about two important community roles. The first is a foundation species. They're usually very abundant and they form the base of a community. These are often producers, but not necessarily all the time. We can see these in kelp forest or even coral. We also have keystone species. These have an outsized impact in relationship to their abundance. So what this means is that a single keystone species can impact a vast number of other species in that area. So removing them can often cause drastic shifts in the community and can even lead to a community collapse. One example of this is the sea star. If we were to remove them, mussel populations would start to increase and dominate that area, reducing biodiversity. Banded tetras are another example, and they affect nutrients. So supplying phosphorus that shapes those tropical streams and communities. Invasive species are non-native organisms that have a negative effect on the ecosystem. These include many plants such as Caesar's weed, or animals like zebra mussels, emerald ash borers, European starlings. Asian carp are a major example. They were introduced in the 1970s and now dominate some rivers. Up to 95% of the biomass in parts of Illinois are threatened because of Asian carp. Another example, a little more local, this Peter's rock agama, they eat a lot of butterflies. And this was actually taken on the building that I work at here at the Seminole campus. So that is a little Peter's, not necessarily little, he's actually pretty big, Peter's rock agama. We also have a lot of Caesar's weed. This was also taken around the nature trail. Caesar's weed was brought here as sort of a crop for cattle, but it just went wild and it chokes out everything around it. The last thing we're going to talk about is community dynamics and succession. Communities aren't static. They may appear stable, but disturbances can change species composition. Succession is the process of change over time after a disturbance. Primary succession starts when there's no soil, like new lava flow. You have pioneer species like lichens that help create soil. So these are the first organisms that are coming, and as they die, their bodies will start to break down into organic matter, and that starts to form that initial soil. So it's the primary succession. Secondary succession occurs after a partial disturbance, like a wildfire. The soil, in this case, still remains. Usually in secondary succession, we start to see things like grasses. and progression to shrubs and forests. So secondary, you have that soil. Primary, there's no soil. If we take a look at how succession works, let's say there's a forest fire. We can see in this first example, the image shows pioneer species. So annual plants, maybe followed by grasses. They're very small. They have a first developing root structure. They start to grow. Then we have intermediate species. These are usually shrubs or smaller trees. Sometimes they can be trees that will grow into larger trees, but they're going to be very young. And eventually they'll develop into what's called a climax community of mature trees that are pretty stable, and they're going to remain stable until the next disturbance. Now, one thing to keep in mind is these systems of succession are not perfect pathways. So it depends on the climate, the seeds that are in the area, the type of disturbance, and even human influence.